Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's Bounty episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. As always, solution to the Spot the Vuln challenge and the pre-stream will be covered in tomorrow's binary episode, which will be at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And let's get into the topics for today's episode. So we'll start off with Apache Server and their issues that were reported recently that were funny enough that they got memed on. Some of you who are in our Discord might have seen. I shared a tweet in the meme channel that it was like the what is the name of that thing with
Now,
the
now
blow your
that you're
house down?
putting me
I
on
don't
the
know why I
spot
can't.
for it, I don't remember. But
I wish I
oh no,
remembered what it
Three Little
was. I
Pigs
feel
or
dumb.
something
Yeah,
like
Three Little
that.
Pigs. That's what it is. That's what I was thinking of. So yeah, it was like a Three Little Pigs meme where it was like because they tried patching this issue and they fumbled it. So yeah, it's been a bit of a meme issue, but
Yeah, and I mean it's one of those issues that wanted to see this in Apache in 2021, and then to see the way they fumbled it as being like the classic way to fumble this sort of issue. It's definitely a memeable issue. It does look like the cause of it was at least a little bit more nuanced. That said, I tried commit surfing on this one to see the commit that actually introduced the bug. Found one commit that's generally getting blamed, but I didn't see, like, it didn't look like it was a direct, or it would have directly caused it. I mean, people would kind of understand the code base, but it wasn't as trivial as you often see these sorts of bugs as being. Um, it had to do more with the logic and kind of a desync between one of the paths looking for just making sure you don't traverse beyond root versus another path which actually loads the file, having a little bit of a desync in terms of how they uh, actually process the URL. Uh, that said, I will also pull up the meme since you were trying to describe it.
yeah. So it's like it starts off with the straw house, and then it goes over to the slightly sturdier house, but then it still gets blown down with Apache's patch. And then I think the third part, we were talking about this a little bit before the stream, but I think the third part is a bit of a meme because, as far as I know, was actually properly fixed in 2.4.51. But still a good meme, I think.
Yeah, and I
So yeah,
guess
like the straw house and the wood house and the brick house. Yeah.
we should mention also, so the issue here was the fact that in some of the code trying to detect the traversals happening, it would look for, a dot dot slash to exist, and basically normalize the path so it would remove those and make sure it's not traversing up beyond the web root. So what you could do is you could do a dot %2e, %2e being a URL encoding of a dot or of a period and then a slash. And that will get around that first check I was talking about that actually looks to make sure you're not going beyond root. But it will later get decoded into a dot dot slash and parsed kind of as you would expect against the file system. So the default configuration did have basically default deny on file. So by default, things weren't really impacted by this unless they either remove that line, which isn't terribly uncommon, to change to more of a default allow, or just to maybe not have line. There's a lot of reasons why people will overwrite lines in the configuration, especially, random HT access kind of changing things on you for one particular path or something. But effectively, encoding that last dot would get you into the right path because it would check for the first actual dot character, %2e, %2e. Wouldn't end up working in this case, as I understand it. It's a really simple issue. Crazy that it happened in Apache. Only impacted 2.4.49. And then, of course, they fixed it, and the patch, you could double encode the value, which kind of the classic fault with trying to fix the issue.
So I guess that
I'm a
is one
little
good thing to shout out with what you were saying there, with it only affecting 2.4.49 and 2.4.50. Because with something like Apache, if it were something that had existed for a long time and went back a few versions, that would be a lot more impactful. But where it's only affecting the specific version, the impact was mitigated a lot more than it could have been a lot more dangerous.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
yeah,
the flip side of that is it's mostly impacting those who are maybe trying to stay secure by doing the updates. So
yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
it's a bit of a double-edged sword in a sense. Although that is why some places won't be on the latest update because this sort of thing happens. And preferring just to go with like extended support releases. That said, I'm a little bit surprised that the double encoding worked and that it would even do the decoding twice. Like you'd kind of just expect it to pass if it's going to do the URL decoding to just do it once. So the fact that it happened twice is a little bit surprising to me.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little surprising to me too. Sorry if there's a lot of background noise right now. Just give me 1 second.
So while Spectre's fixing its background noise, I will take from chat. It was on the newest version at the time, right? That's from I8BR. Yes, that is the latest version. Well, 2451 is the latest version now, but at the time, yes, latest version. So I kind of agree with you. Probably not like a ton of machines getting hit by that. Apache's generally kind of slower to update in my experience. A lot of shared hosts on it, which generally don't have the best update practices in general. It feels a little bit kind of legacy. Nonetheless, this sort of issue is uh it is memeable. We've seen the memes on it. Oh no, Spectre. Do you want to try talking again? See if your audio's any
Yeah,
better?
I think at least right now it should be okay. Um, but yeah, I mean, just a really strange issue, and like you said, it might seem trivial at first, but when you look into the details, it's kind of specific with how this bug works. So yeah, I guess we move on to the next report, which is a hacker1 issue. Z, I'll let you cover this one as well, just so that my background noise doesn't pollute the video too much.
Fair enough.
Actually, if you
Yeah.
can cover this issue, I'll just take a minute or two and try to actually like fully fix it,
All right.
and then I'll be back.
All right. Yeah. So this is a fairly straightforward issue, but I thought it was an interesting bug. So this is in what was it? Zomato. I'm not too familiar with them. I've definitely seen them on HackerOne quite a bit. Seems like they have a fairly active program. But the issue here had to do with how they were sending their OTPs. So in the request for an OTP, they'd have the user verify their phone number. And there would also be the country ISD, which is kind of that first bit of the number before your actual phone number. So like in Canada, US, that's one. In other countries, there is potentially a longer number, might be a single digit, but there's some number before kind of the proper phone number. So what they were doing apparently is they would only actually validate the phone number that was entered, but not that country code that was entered also. And that country code might have just been a drop down, but in the JSON of the request here, they could, or an attacker could control it. So what they were able to do with that is actually inject their own phone number into the country ID, and then just end up with a comma at the end of that. So that would tell whatever their backend server that you actually want to send this off to two phone numbers. It would kind of generate this one. It would think because it goes and appends the country ID to the or prepends the country ID to the phone number. It would kind of create this one really large, really long phone number that would get parsed as two phone numbers. So it actually send the OTP to both phone numbers, being comma separated in this case. They also make mention of separated by spaces. I'm not sure if that just didn't work with this particular request, or if it did any sort of stripping on the string, for example, or it might not work. So in this case, They were basically able to enter their own number and just have the OTP duplicated out to them, which I think is a great little bug. Definitely kind of a fun issue. I like saying that phrase, but it's one of those things that understanding how the backend works, understand that this would even be a potential issue really helps with finding issues, finding those kind of more subtle issues, because this isn't just a traditional, SQL injection or something. This kind of takes that knowledge of the internal system.
Yeah,
Um,
so it's kind of cool because and sorry if I retread on something you already said because I only came back recently, but it's something that initially doesn't really seem like it could really be taken advantage of. It seems like a very useless primitive at first. But then, like you were saying, like how that back end is architected allows it to be more useful than it otherwise would be. So, yeah, it was cool to see. Another thing I wanted to highlight, I don't know if you pointed this out already, but Zomato's summary here with how they did the timeline kind of blew me away. Um, this is by far the most detailed and well written timeline I've ever seen, and it's coming from the vendor side, which is also like really weird. You can see at the top there, they have dates, like exactly what happened, where severity rating changes happened, back and forth summaries, just like a very extensive and detailed timeline. So it was very cool to see that. Um, the issue was fixed pretty quickly. It was reported September 24th last year and fixed the 26th. Disclosure though took a while because obviously, we're here a year later. But all things considered, like this gave me a positive impression on Zomato and how they handle their bounty program. Personally,
yeah, so we haven't covered a lot of Zomato issues. I'm trying to load up their HackerOne page now, but I do see them. Yeah, reports received 914. They're a fairly active program. I do see them pop up quite often.
yeah. So yeah, good report overall. Our next post is from CoralDev and talks about an issue they discovered while doing some bounty hunting on a private HackerOne program they were invited to. As such, where it is a private program, we don't know what application or company contained the issue, but that's not really necessary for talking about what the issue actually was. So again, this is one of those posts that goes into kind of a diary style where they started, like talking about where they started and things they tried before ultimately finding an issue, which we always appreciate. It talks about some of the recon and looking at what they were using for authentication and some of the infrastructure. Basically, this company ended up using Express.js for the web front end, and they used JWT for sessions. One of the features he tunneled in on was the ability to invite users to a group and change their account's privileges or scopes. After doing some digging, he discovered there were some scopes that don't appear in the edit user privilege menu, basically some hidden scopes, including ones used for employees, like support and operation scopes. And by trying to invite another user into the group and setting the employee scope on them by changing the request with burp, they managed to do that successfully. They could invite people with a higher scope than what they themselves had access to. Um, so
Well,
the
so
application,
not exactly a higher scope. So I guess this kind of comes down to how JWTs work, in the fact that basically you've got some sort of signing authority. It's signing, in theory, it should be. I mean, there is the whole algorithm non-issues that we've seen a few times. But it's signing a thing, and it just says like this person has these scopes, and those scopes aren't really a hierarchy at all. It's not like you have. Well, you can structure it in a way that is a bit of a hierarchy, but generally it's used so that like if an API gets to JWT, you can see, is this JWT signed or valid? Should also have an expiry date. Doesn't need it, but it should. And then it can just look, do they have the scope to access my API? So that's what seemed to be going on in this case. Is these were just scopes that existed but weren't visible in the UI at all. But you can still add them. I'd be interested to know if they were able to add arbitrary scopes or if they did have to exist somewhere. In theory, if it's just taking whatever scopes you you can enter anything, and if it happens to match the ones, which is a little bit more powerful than if they have to kind of be validated on the server side as at least existing. But yeah, I mean, effectively, it was one of those edit user pages, change it to give yourself extra privileges. And this actually happened twice. In this add user where you'd add them into your group and then change their account scope. You could also do it against your own API tokens. They mentioned that, and kind of one of the next stages is, yeah, you can create an API keys for your account and assign scopes to it. Same issue there.
So just to clarify a bit there with what I was talking about with like privilege, like permissions and gaining permissions higher than what you already had. The reason I kind of put it that way is because to frame it as like a privilege escalation, which is also how the blog post frames it as well. But yeah, I wasn't trying to say there was like a hierarchy of.
I mean, it is a privilege escalation still when you think about it in the sense of you're getting scopes that you're not supposed to have.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's just a minor nuance I wanted to point out with regards to how JWTs work.
Yeah, all good. So yeah, the first issue gave a $3,000 bounty, and then the second issue, as he pointed out, also netted $3K. So yeah, overall a good haul for this researcher, and
good haul. But I will call out, I don't think this is a 9.9 CVSS.
You think it's rated too high?
I do. So it does depend a little bit, but the only way you're getting 9.9 is, of course, it is on the network. That's fair. Low attack complexity, I'll give them that. Whether or not privilege is required should be none or low. I think you can debate a little bit. Technically, you do need to log in, create a group. Presuming this is kind of open to everybody, I can even give them a none there, no user interaction. But does this really have high availability impact, for example? I don't know what exists in that company support and operations. Perhaps you can just shut down everything. But
that would be pretty
feel
insane
like it's
that was the case.
A little bit of a stretch to give this one, 9.9 for it. Given some of the limitations around it. I don't know. I mean, there's probably an argument to be made. I just feel like that's probably too high. That said, without knowing more about the actual company, without knowing more about what was enabled there, you might be able to make that argument for sure. And obviously he knows more, but it definitely kind of stood out for me because 9.9, actually, I guess you'd get a 10 if you gave it everything, and it's 9.8 the scope. So
maybe it was a typo.
No, so 9.9, he probably gave that a low privileges required, so it did include that login as being necessary. But then has the scope as being changed. Which, yeah, I guess JWT, you can definitely argue that you're leaving the scope, like you're changing scopes out of that application to some other authority. Arguable, depending on how these APIs work. But I mean that's how you'd get a 9.9. Because yeah, if everything were maxed out, it would be a 10. And I don't think there's too much else that would really bring you right to that 9.9. But on, and yeah, it's a little bit off to me, but still, to be clear, still a serious issue. Yeah, especially since
it's hard to.
Go ahead.
It's hard to make judgment calls on the CVSS score where we're not even sure what the target application is. So yeah, like we can't really know anything about the like target infrastructure and how it's set up.
No, although when it comes to how you actually make the CVS score, like how far you're willing to stretch and like combine things like, well, I have access to this, which gives me this, which gives me this, and like how far you take that chain out is a little bit debatable. So like this core issue is just adding some of those privileges. How far out do you extend that in order to create the scenario for like a high availability drop. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of things kind of up in the air. It did stand out to me that this was 9.9 versus something a bit lower.
And I guess
But
this is one of those cases where it's why we've, like, personally, I haven't really been a fan of CVSS scores because they don't really tell you very much.
oh,
It's
they
very easy
they
to stretch certain factors, um, and
they
there's like
tell
some
you plenty,
speculation going on there too. I mean, they tell you something, but
but
generally,
it's
I don't think it's good to make judgments just off the CVSS because they're off.
CVSS
It's easy
has
for
a
them to be wrong or just misinterpreted.
it's not useful, I don't think, in terms of like writing exploits, bounties. I don't care. That said, on the defensive side, working in a company, CVSS is very useful to know, to track kind of just the global. Here's what it gave access to. The CIA confidentiality, integrity, availability. Just knowing how those things were impacted by a vulnerability. Those high level overviews are very valuable in the right scenario, but it doesn't capture everything about a vulnerability. Uh, I think it's just about context rather than kind of just outright saying CVSS isn't useful.
Yeah, so
It's
I'm not
all
trying to
about your
argue that it's not
context.
useful, but what I am kind of arguing is that it seems a lot of people put too much stock in it.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah.
so that's kind of where I'd put that. But yeah, like you said, definitely a serious issue, and it kind of sucks that we don't know what the target application is because we could do more of that speculation on how this could be taken advantage of and talk a bit about more like how the availability and stuff could be impacted. But where it's a private program, obviously we don't have any of that information.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that this does give you some access to an API, the scope is company operations, that does sound significant to me, as like there's potential for availability hit there.
Yeah. All right, so finally, we have a ZDI blog post on an RCE and SharePoint through SharePoint workflows, which are like automation apps. Workflows are powerful, so Microsoft tries to lock them down, make it so workflows will only run if all the assemblies and types are authorized against the web config file. It also used that file to do some blacklisting against dangerous types from allowed namespaces to allow some more fine-grained control. Um, One example they show there is accessing something like the workflow compiler, which would be dangerous because it would an attacker ran workflow would be able to run like it's usually ran in a restricted context, but being able to access the workflow compiler would allow them to create a new context that wouldn't have those same restrictions. So that's obviously blocked. But the issue here comes into play when they're using like that blacklisting. And if you take a look at the compile method for that workflow compiler class that they talk about, you'll see that it basically wraps around a workflow compiler internal class for doing the heavy lifting. And while the workflow compiler class is blocked, the workflow compiler internal class isn't blocked. In fact, it's explicitly allowed in their list. So because you can just access the underlying routine that's actually doing the work, um, that can be used to compile an arbitrary workflow that can execute something like .NET commands, which is where the code execution comes from, and then that can be taken advantage of from an attacker-controlled workflow. So there is a few stipulations here that ZDI points out that you would. There's a few scenarios that you would need um, to take advantage of beyond needing to be able to get some control over a workflow. First and foremost, you would need to be able to get your attack XAML file containing those malicious.NET commands in an accessible place to abuse the issue. I think like their go-to example for that is like a Samba or something like that, a Samba server.
It is a
Secondly,
requirement. I do feel like that one's not a huge barrier, given
it's
that
not a
you're
huge ask.
already an attacker in SharePoint with the ability to at least create workflows. Oh, odds are there's going to be like some Samba shares that you're able to write to somewhere in that same network. I can imagine this one being more of like a red teamer looking to escalate, who has access on one thing, has access in other areas of the network too. I know this is our bounty issue, but this issue does feel a little bit more like something you'd abuse on a pen test. but the whole idea of the blacklisting is definitely valid elsewhere. Sorry, I'll let you carry on.
Yeah, no worries. The other thing is you would need to be able to create a workflow config file that would point to that XAML file and its respective rules file. Again, I think that kind of falls into the category that Z just covered, where it's not a totally unrealistic scenario, and ZDI points this out themselves. They kind of state that SharePoint is a very juicy attack surface that has been hit in the wild before, where it's used in like the enterprise environments and stuff. So an attack like this, even though those stipulations are there, it doesn't make the attack like not viable or not like a realistic scenario. It's totally possible this could be taken advantage of, and they even point out in the conclusion of their post that it wouldn't be surprising if this were found in the wild. So yeah, I mean, kind of an interesting issue, although it mostly falls back on that same thing where, um, you know, doing like, well, they do blacklisting and like whitelisting too. They kind of do both, but it's
Yes,
so
but
easy to have an
blacklisting is hard.
insufficient. Yeah, it's really hard to do it perfectly. I'd say it's like almost impossible for like any monolithic application. So yeah, I mean that's what it boils down to here is just a bad blacklisting and allow listing.
Yeah, for
Um,
what it's worth, I have seen this sort of issue in the wild myself with a blacklist banning uh let's just say one type, but not banning how it was actually implemented, so like the internal type. And that sort of separation where you have kind of the public user interface effectively to the class, and then you have the internal class, which is what actually does the work. Definitely is pretty common among I see it a ton in Java stuff. Obviously, here it's for .NET code, but that sort of setup is common, so it is something to keep an eye out for when you're running into suppose kind of more on the deserialization issue would be where you'd kind of run into the ability to abuse that. Uh, yeah, just worth keeping in mind. Like, it's a great little bug to be aware of if you haven't really thought about that aspect before. Sometimes there are other ways to reach the critical code beyond just using the or sensitive code beyond just using the obvious interfaces.
it's easy to get lost in the layers of abstraction for sure.
Yes, Java
So
is famous for that one. Not
yeah,
that a bit too, but in Java, I that's one of the things I dislike about Java is just all the layers of abstraction you tend to get.
yeah, and it makes something like blacklisting particularly tricky to get right. Balika, thanks for the tier 1 sub. 9 months. Damn, you've been with us for a long time now. Thank you, dude. Um, but yeah, like not too much more to go into there. Fairly straightforward issue as far as ZDI posts go. It looks long when you go into it, but it's mostly because they have a lot of like images and code snippets just kind of detailing what they're talking about. They
And
actually
they
have a full
have
section on how they like pocket, which might be interesting, but it to you. But we're not going to cover it here.
Yeah, well, they have that whole section on like, the pictures as they click through the application to create the workflow, which is a bit more detailed than some of the ZDI posts we've covered before, and it does definitely add to the length of it. But on the whole, it was a fairly clear post. I mean, I mostly just focused on the beginning part because that's the interesting part to me, but I mean, it's there. Yeah, I mean, it's also, like I've said a couple times, one of those issues that, yes, this exists in SharePoint. I'm confident, this will be found in the wild in other types of applications that try and do that blacklisting too.
There's something to keep a lookout for if you're looking in a similar type of application or the application is set up in a similar way. So yeah, it's good to call out. So yeah, that concludes all the topics we have for this episode. Sorry for it being a little bit shorter. We were a bit limited on topics for this week because it was a bit of a slower week. So um, it was a little short,
Yes,
but
slower week, but I mean, I like these. All of these bugs I thought were fairly interesting. Like obviously the Apache one had plenty of memes about it. Crazy that was even there, but Even the other bugs, the Zomato one, the JWT stuff, like all interesting bugs this week. So I'm happy with the results there, but not a lot of good write ups this week.
Yeah, and that happens, especially when we're getting closer to the end of the year. So, um, yeah, and also sorry for anyone who might have heard some of that background noise earlier. That was definitely a mistake on my end. So, hopefully that won't happen again. But yeah, with that said, thanks to everyone who tuned in. The VOD will be up on Twitch, and it will also be up on other platforms like YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and others tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern. Feel free to join the Discord and follow us on Twitter. I'll put the link in chat for those who are with us live. But the link for the Discord and everything can also be found below in the video description, which is also where we'll have a link to Z's summary page, where it has like all the summaries for the topics we covered this week. That said, we'll be back tomorrow for the binary episode at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And have a good Thanksgiving for all the Canadians out there, and we'll see you tomorrow.